Fine, let's start. Number 1. The Ofnet Cave Skull Nests. In the year 1908, an archaeologist named Robert Rudolf Schmidt was digging in a small cave near the town of Nördlingen, in the Nördlinger Ries of Bavaria. He found 2 shallow pits cut into the cave floor. One was about 60 centimeters across, the other about 40. Inside them, packed tightly together, were human skulls. Somewhere between 33 and 38 of them, depending on how you count the fragments. Schmidt said they lay like eggs in a basket. Every single one of them had been arranged to face west. The skulls were stained a deep red. This was ochre, a natural mineral pigment that prehistoric people used, again and again, in their treatment of the dead. But the color was not the disturbing part. The disturbing part was what the bones themselves recorded. Many of the skulls still held the topmost neck vertebra, and those vertebrae carried fine-cut marks. That detail matters. It means the heads were separated from bodies that were still fresh, cut away with stone tools, not gathered as loose bones long after death. Look closer, and the picture darkens further. The dead were mostly women and children. Adult men are strangely rare in the pits, and a large number of the skulls show blunt injuries delivered at or around the moment of death, the kind of damage an axe or a heavy club leaves behind. Alongside the heads lay ornaments, pierced red deer teeth, and hundreds of perforated snail shells, and these clustered more around the women and the children. Now, how do we explain this? Here the experts divide. The mainstream reading is a massacre, a raid that fell on the vulnerable members of a hunter-gatherer band roughly 6,400 to 6,300 years before the Common Era, in the late Mesolithic, long before farming reached this part of Europe. A second, more archaeological reading says, the deposit is a skull cult, a curated cemetery of heads collected and honored over a stretch of time, rather than in one bloody afternoon. The researcher Jörg Orschiet re-examined the remains and argued that the collection may indeed be time-averaged, which would soften the massacre story. A third, more speculative view treats it as ongoing ritual headhunting, a practice with parallels in the ethnographic record around the world. The trauma pattern at Ofnet has been cited by researchers such as Rick Schulting as some of the earliest hard evidence for organized violence in Mesolithic Europe. The ornaments matter to the debate as well, because the pierced deer teeth and the hundreds of worked snail shells took real effort to make, and they were left with the heads rather than kept by the living. That suggests the skulls were treated as something to be honored, whatever violence brought them there. It is this blend of brutality and reverence that makes Ofnet so hard to categorize. There is one more twist. The cave sits inside an ancient meteorite crater, the Ries, blasted out about 14.8 million years ago, and the original skulls were largely lost during the Second World War, so today, much of the work relies on the casts and the detailed records made before the fighting. Whatever the exact story, Ofnet tells us something unsettling. Organized, lethal violence against the weakest people in a community was already happening before anyone planted a field. Which raises a question. If the hunter-gatherers were capable of this, what happened when people began to farm and to own land worth killing for? Number 2. The Potočani mass grave. The answer starts in eastern Croatia. In the year 2007, workers digging the foundation for a garage near the village of Potočani cut into a pit they were not expecting. It was small, about 2 meters wide and only a meter deep. Into that cramped space had been thrown the tangled bones of at least 41 people. Radiocarbon dating placed the burial around 4,200 years before the Common Era, in the Middle Copper Age, among people linked to the Lasinja culture. When the anthropologist Mario Novak and his team at the Institute for Anthropological Research in Zagreb studied the skeletons, they found that at least 13 of the dead had cracked and broken skulls, injuries inflicted right at the time of death, and the pattern of those wounds is telling. The blows landed on the backs and the sides of the heads. That is where you get struck when you are running away, or when someone is standing behind you and you cannot fight back. The dead came from every stage of life, men and women, the old and the very young, with children well represented. But the truly surprising discovery came from their DNA. In a study published in the year 2021, Novak's team sequenced the ancient genomes and asked a simple question: were these people family? The answer was no. The victims were, for the most part, not closely related to one another. That single result reshapes everything. A pit full of one family would suggest a feud, a targeted strike against a lineage. But a pit full of unrelated people points to something colder and broader: the indiscriminate slaughter of a whole community. And the mathematics of the dead suggest those 41 were only a portion of a larger group, which means this was a raid on a population, not the erasure of it. Genetically, the victims were ordinary Copper Age farmers, no different from the people around them, so this was not outsiders being purged for looking strange. Why did it happen? Novak pointed to a familiar suspect: a changing climate and a growing population pressing on limited land and food. When resources tighten, violence often follows. There was no careful burial here, no arrangement of the bodies beyond what the walls of the small pit forced upon them. Potočani now sits alongside the other great massacre sites of ancient Europe, and it teaches a hard lesson. Sometimes prehistoric violence was not personal at all. It was simply aimed at everyone. But not every massacre ended with the dead dumped and forgotten. Sometimes the people who came afterward did something that makes the horror even harder to bear. Number 3. The Koszyce family massacre. In southern Poland, near the village of Koszyce, archaeologists uncovered a grave dated to roughly 2,880 to 2,776 years before the Common Era, in the late Neolithic. It belonged to the globular amphora culture. Inside were 15 people: women, children, teenagers, and a few men. Every one of them had died the same way, from heavy blows to the head, mostly landing on the top and the back of the skull. So far, this sounds like another massacre. What makes Koszyce unforgettable is what the science revealed next. In the year 2019, a team led by Hannes Schroeder and Niels Nurkjer Johansen published a study in which they sequenced the complete genomes of all 15 victims. And unlike at Potočani, these people were family. One single extended family, spanning several generations, all killed together. The genetics let the researchers rebuild the family tree, and then they compared it to how the bodies were laid in the grave. What they found is heartbreaking. Mothers had been placed beside their own children. Brothers and sisters lay together. The dead were not thrown in at random. They were arranged with knowledge and with care, each person set beside the people they had loved in life. Here is the crucial detail. The adult men who should have headed these families, the fathers, were largely missing from among the dead. And that absence is the clue that solves the scene. The people who buried this family were almost certainly the survivors, the men who were away when the killers came. They returned to find their wives, their children, their parents slaughtered, and then, knowing exactly who belonged to whom, they laid them in the earth together. One last reunion. The grave held their possessions too. The round-bellied pottery that gives the globular amphora culture its name, tools of flint and bone, and ornaments of amber. The genetic work went further than simply proving one family. It identified 4 nuclear families, interlinked by marriage, which showed that these people married outside their immediate kin group, a practice called exogamy. Strontium analysis indicated they were a settled local community, not migrants passing through. The timing helps explain the killing. This was a period of upheaval across Europe, as new peoples with steppe ancestry, the ancestors of the corded ware culture, pushed into the continent. Populations collided and conflict followed. The Koszyce family may have been casualties of that turbulent age. The kinship analysis stands as one of the most complete ever done for any prehistoric grave, and it delivers a paradox that runs through this whole subject. The same species that could club an entire family to death could also, in its grief, bury them with tenderness and precision. Violence and love, side by side in a single pit. Now we leave the small family grave behind, and we scale up to a place where the dead are counted not in the tens, but in the hundreds. Number 4. San Juan, Ante Portam, Latinam. The name means St. John before the Latin gate, taken from a nearby hermitage. But the rock shelter it labels, in the Rioja Alavesa region of the Basque country in northern Spain, holds something far older and far grimmer. Beginning in the year 1985, the archaeologist José Ignacio Vegas led excavations here and uncovered a collective burial from the late Neolithic, dated to somewhere between 3,400 and 3,000 years before the Common Era. The number of bodies is staggering. An estimated 338 individuals, one of the largest such assemblages ever found in Iberia. At first, the sheer quantity might suggest a natural cemetery, generations of a community laid to rest. But the bones tell a story of violence. Scattered through the burial were flint and stone arrowheads, and some of them were not just lying loose. They were embedded directly in the bones of the dead, lodged in vertebrae, stuck between ribs, driven into limbs. Many skulls also carried the marks of trauma, some healed, some not. In the year 2023, the researcher Teresa Fernandez Crespo and her colleagues published a careful statistical reanalysis of these injuries in the journal Scientific Reports. Their conclusion pushed the story of European warfare back in time. About 23% of the individuals showed skeletal injuries, and the men were affected far more often than the women. Crucially, many of those injuries had begun to heal. That means these people were not all killed in one battle on one day. They survived wounds, recovered, and were hurt again. This was a community living through a long period of recurring conflict. The overrepresentation of young adult males fits that picture exactly. These were the warriors, the ones sent out to fight and raid, dying in skirmish after skirmish over years. And the heavy presence of arrow wounds tells us how they died, through projectile weapons, the arrows of an enemy. The arrowheads themselves are typical late Neolithic forms, transverse and pointed flint tips. The shelter was likely used as a burial place over a stretch of time, so it gathered both the violently killed and those who died of natural causes, layering an ordinary cemetery with the evidence of war. That mixture is exactly why the statistical reanalysis mattered so much, because it separated the everyday dead from the pattern of injury that signals sustained conflict. For a long time, scholars imagined that violence among Europe's early farmers was sporadic, small, a matter of the occasional quarrel. San Juan Ante Portam Latinam helped overturn that comfortable idea. Here was evidence not just of interpersonal violence, but of organized, sustained warfare, embedded in the bones of hundreds of people over a span of time. The bones are now curated by institutions in the Basque country, where they continue to be studied, and they force us to accept that war, real war, is far older than any written record of it. But not all prehistoric brutality was aimed at armies or communities. Sometimes it was focused, with terrible precision, on a single small body. Number 5. The Kayhausen Boy. In the year 1922, peat cutters working a bog near Kayhausen in Lower Saxony in northern Germany found the body of a child. Radiocarbon dating would later place the death at around 300 years before the Common Era in the pre-Roman Iron Age. The child was young, somewhere between 7 and 10 years old, and is generally identified as a boy. What had been done to him is deeply hard to hear. His hands had been tied behind his back, using strips of cloth torn from a woolen cloak, quite possibly his own. His ankles were bound as well, and a further length of binding connected the ties at his wrists to the ties at his ankles, so that the child was completely hobbled, unable to run, unable even to straighten his body. Then he was stabbed. There were multiple wounds, including to his neck and his left arm, and his throat was cut. Finally, his small bound body was sunk into the bog. The bog is why we know any of this. The water in these northern peat bogs is cold, acidic, starved of oxygen, and rich in tannins, and that combination halts decay and preserves soft tissue and even textiles for thousands of years. Because of the bog, we have not just the boy's skeleton, but the actual cloth that bound him. There is another detail that has haunted researchers. The child's skeleton suggests he may have had a condition affecting his hip, something that could have made walking difficult. That possible disability has fed one of the leading interpretations of his death, that this was a ritual killing, perhaps the sacrifice of a child seen as different or marked in some way. Across northern Europe, the bog bodies of this era share a grim signature, binding, and what archaeologists call overkill, far more violence than would be needed simply to end a life. That points away from ordinary murder and toward ritual. The Kayhausen Boy is among the youngest bog bodies ever documented. The bindings prove he was restrained before he died, not arranged afterward, and his case has become central to a difficult conversation about how prehistoric societies treated their disabled, their vulnerable, and their outsiders. Whether he was a sacrifice, an execution, or a scapegoat, the intimacy of his killing lingers. This was not a faceless massacre. Someone tied this child, wound by wound, and lowered him into the dark water. Now we turn to a form of brutality that unsettles people even more than murder, because it treats the human body as food. Number 6. Moula-Guercy Cave. High above the Rhone Valley, in the Ardèche region of southeastern France, sits a cave called Moula-Guercy. Excavations here, led by the researcher Alban de Fleur, reached a layer dated to around 100,000 years ago, deep in the last interglacial. In that layer were the broken bones of at least 6 Neanderthals, adults and children among them. And those bones carried a story written in cut marks. The Neanderthal remains showed fine slices from stone tools, small pits where the bone had been struck, and abrasions where it had been laid against an anvil stone and cracked open. On their own, such marks could mean several things, but Moula-Guercy offered a control sitting right there in the same deposit. Alongside the Neanderthal bones lay the bones of red deer, ordinary prey animals, and the deer bones showed the exact same treatment. The same cutting to remove muscle, the same disarticulation of the joints, the same smashing of the shafts to reach the marrow inside. When human bones are butchered in precisely the way animals are butchered for food, the conclusion is hard to avoid. The skulls had been opened, the limb bones broken apart, in a pattern that matches the extraction of brain and marrow, the richest, most calorie-dense tissues. De Fleur and his colleagues published these findings in the journal Science in the year 1999, and it became one of the clearest forensic cases of Neanderthal cannibalism ever made. The stone tools found with the bones were Mousterian, the classic Neanderthal toolkit. There was no sign of ritual arrangement, no careful positioning that might suggest a mortuary ceremony. This looked like processing, like food. Yet the interpretation is not entirely settled, and the reason is the climate. 100,000 years ago, this was a warm interglacial period, not a frozen crisis. So while some researchers see survival cannibalism, people driven to it by starvation, others argue it may have been more habitual, or tied to warfare between groups. The well-sealed layer gives confidence in the dating and the context, and the cut marks cluster exactly where muscles attach to bone. Moula-Guercy, together with sites like El Cedron and Krapina, forced a hard rethinking of who the Neanderthals were. For a long time, they were romanticized or dismissed as simple brutes. The reality is more complicated and more human. They made tools. They lived in warm and cold worlds. And at least sometimes, they ate their own kind. And the argument over why they did it leads straight to the oldest and most contested cannibalism site of them all. Number 7. Krapina. More than a century ago, between the years 1899 and 1905, a Croatian scholar named Dragutin Gorjanović Kramberger excavated a rock shelter at Husnjakovo Hill, near the town of Krapina in northern Croatia. What he pulled from the ground was extraordinary. More than 800 fragments of Neanderthal bone, representing dozens of individuals, dated to roughly 130,000 years ago, in the warm Eemian interglacial. It remains one of the richest single collections of Neanderthal remains ever found. Gorjanović Kramberger noticed something on those bones, cut marks and traces of burning, and he made a claim that was genuinely radical for his time. He suggested cannibalism. In an era that could barely accept that Neanderthals existed at all, proposing that they ate one another was bold to the point of scandal. The bones supported his suspicion in some ways. They were heavily fragmented, and the long bones had been split lengthwise, exactly what you would do to get at the marrow. But Krapina is not a closed case. It is, in fact, the great open question of prehistoric cannibalism, argued back and forth for over 100 years. Modern researchers, including Jörg Orschiet and Mary Russell, have re-examined the cut marks in detail. Some of them concluded that the pattern fits not eating, but mortuary practice, the cleaning of bones, the defleshing of the dead as part of a funeral rite rather than a meal. The burning on some bones raises the possibility of cooking, but that too is contested, and the warm Eemian climate again undercuts any simple starvation explanation. There's another side to Krapina that complicates the brutal image. In the year 2015, researchers led by Davorka Radovčić reported eagle talons from the site that appear to have been worked and worn as jewelry, some of the earliest evidence of symbolic ornament in the human story. So the same site that may record cannibalism also records a sense of beauty and display. The remains are held today at the Croatian Natural History Museum in Zagreb, and the town opened a dedicated Krapina Neanderthal Museum in the year 2010. Whether the people of Krapina were eaten or ceremonially cleaned, the site anchored the entire debate over how Neanderthals treated their dead. Gorjanović Kramberger's meticulous records made it possible to keep asking the question long after his death. And that is the deeper lesson of Krapina. Sometimes the ground gives us the evidence, but not the answer. From the ancient bones of the Neanderthals, we now return to a body so complete it looks almost asleep. Number 8. The Huldremose Woman. In the year 1879, peat diggers in a bog at Huldremose, on the Djursland Peninsula of Denmark, uncovered the body of a woman. She had died around 2,000 years ago, in the pre-Roman Iron Age, with dating estimates spanning from about 160 years before the Common Era to the centuries just after. She was more than 40 years old at death, which made her genuinely old for her time. What sets the Huldremose Woman apart is how completely she survived, and how well dressed she was. She wore 2 capes of animal skin, a woolen scarf, and a checked woolen skirt. The wool in her clothing came from a whole flock of sheep, which tells us how much labor and material went into dressing a person in this society. With her were personal items, a horn comb, a leather thong, and a single blue glass bead, small signs of adornment and status. The bog's tannins had preserved her skin, her long-tied hair, and every thread of her garments. There is a darker detail. One of her arms bore a deep cut, and early accounts claim the arm had been nearly severed before she died. That claim has since been debated, because some of the damage may have happened after death, or even during her discovery. So, unlike the clearly murdered bog bodies, the Huldremose Woman keeps her secret. We do not know for certain whether she was sacrificed, executed, or simply died and was later disturbed. Science has kept working on her. Analysis of her gut contents revealed a last meal that included rye bread, a small, human detail across 2,000 years. Strontium isotope studies of her remains suggested she may have grown up somewhere other than where she died, hinting at a life that involved movement across the landscape. Her long hair had been carefully tied, and studies of her body recovered information about her health and nutrition, building a portrait of a real person rather than an anonymous corpse. Modern CT scanning has let researchers look inside her without damaging the delicate remains. She is now held and displayed at the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen. The Huldremose Woman matters for two reasons. Her clothing is one of the best windows we have into how people actually dressed in Iron Age Scandinavia, and her body shows just how much organic culture, the cloth and hair and skin that normally rot to nothing, a bog can preserve. She reminds us that not every disturbing discovery comes with a clear crime attached. Sometimes the brutality is only suspected, hovering at the edge of the evidence. Next, we go back much further, to a grave from the Ice Age that pairs unimaginable beauty with a genuinely strange horror. Number 9. The Sunghir Burials. Near the Russian city of Vladimir, about 200 kilometers east of Moscow, lies an Upper Paleolithic site called Sunghir. The archaeologist Otto Bader began excavating it in the year 1955 and worked there through the following decade. The site dates to somewhere between 34,000 and 30,000 years ago, and it belonged to early modern humans living through the Ice Age. Its most famous feature is a single grave holding two children laid head to head. The wealth buried with those children defies belief. Their clothing had been covered in roughly 10,000 beads carved from mammoth ivory. Making that many beads by hand would have taken thousands of hours of skilled labor, an investment that signals these were no ordinary children, but people of high status or special meaning. Beside them lay spears made from mammoth ivory that had somehow been straightened, a remarkable technical achievement given how ivory naturally curves. There were carved ivory animals, pierced fox teeth, and batons of antler. Red ochre had been used lavishly, lining the grave and coating the bodies. And then there is the detail that turns wonder into unease. One of the children had thigh bones that were unusually short, and they had been packed with red ochre, with signs that the bones may have been deliberately broken or modified. No one is certain what this means. It has fueled a long debate about disability, and about what special treatment in death might have signified for a child whose body was different. In the year 2017, a genetic study led by Martin Sikora and published in Science examined the DNA of the people buried at Sunghir. The result was unexpected. The individuals in the grave were not close relatives. For an Ice Age band, that carries a profound implication. These people were deliberately avoiding inbreeding, marrying outside their immediate group, maintaining social networks wide enough to keep their small population genetically healthy. A nearby grave held an adult man, labeled Sunghir One, also buried beneath thousands of ivory beads. The uniformity of the beads is itself a clue, because 10,000 nearly identical objects imply a standardized method of production, a kind of craft specialization we rarely associate with people this ancient. Elaborate burials of children are especially unusual for the Paleolithic, when the young were seldom given such treatment, which only deepens the puzzle of who these two children were and why they were honored so extravagantly. Sunghir is one of our clearest windows into the social world of Ice Age hunter-gatherers, a world far more complex than the caveman stereotype allows. Standardized bead production, elaborate child burials, ivory spears, careful marriage networks. And yet, woven through all that sophistication, the broken and ochre-packed bones of a child remind us that their rituals could be strange and unsettling by our standards. From this Ice Age grave, we come at last to the discovery that gave this whole grim subject its clearest single image. Number 10. The Talheim Death Pit. In the year 1983, at Talheim in the Neckar Valley of southwestern Germany, archaeologists uncovered a pit that would become a landmark in the study of ancient violence. Inside it were 34 people, dating to around 5,000 years before the Common Era, roughly 7,000 years ago. They belonged to the linear pottery culture, known by its German name Linear Bandkeramik, or LBK, the first farming society of Central Europe. The dead were 16 children and 18 adults, both men and women, almost certainly an entire small community, or a large part of one, and they had not been buried. They had been thrown into the pit, without order, without ritual, without the careful positioning that normally marked LBK graves. The anthropologists Joachim Wahl and H.G. Koenig studied the skeletons and established the cause of death: blunt force blows to the head. When they compared the shape of the wounds to the tools of the period, they found a chilling match. The injuries fit the stone adzes that these farmers used every day, the so-called shoelast celts, tools that doubled as weapons. At least 2 of the victims also had arrow wounds, so the attackers used projectiles as well as clubs. And the placement of the blows tells the same story we have seen again and again. Most struck the back or the side of the skull, the signature of people cut down while fleeing, or killed while held captive and defenseless. There were no defensive wounds on their arms, meaning they never got the chance to fight back. Talheim is one of the earliest clear mass killings of Europe's first farmers, and it belongs to a wider pattern. It dates to the final troubled phase of the LBK, a time of apparent crisis and rising violence. Isotope analysis hinted that some of the victims came from different origins than others, suggesting conflict between communities rather than within one. And there is a haunting absence. Young women are underrepresented among the dead, which has led some researchers to suspect they were not killed but abducted by the attackers. Together with the sites of Aspern-Schletz in Austria and Schöneck-Kilienstetten in Germany, Talheim defines what scholars now call the LBK massacre horizon. The adze wounds even allowed a reconstruction of how many attackers there were and which hands they favored. Above all, Talheim shattered a cherished assumption: the idea that the dawn of farming was a peaceful age of gardens and pottery. It was not. The first farmers could exterminate one another as thoroughly as any later army, and that discovery, more than any other, earned its place among the finds too brutal for the tidy pages of a textbook. Step back from the 10 sites, and patterns begin to surface. The most consistent is the location of the wounds. Again and again, from Potočani to Talheim to Koszyce, the fatal blows fell on the back and the side of the skull. That is not the geometry of a fair fight. It is the geometry of ambush, of pursuit, of execution. It is what happens to people who are running, kneeling, or bound. A second pattern is who died. Women and children appear over and over among the victims, at Ofnet, at Talheim, at Koszyce, at Potočani. And at Talheim, the strange scarcity of young women suggests they were carried off rather than killed, turning massacre into abduction. A third thread is the role of family. At Potočani, the victims were unrelated, an entire community struck down. At Koszyce, they were a single family, buried by the survivors who knew each face. Then there is the separate category of cannibalism, at Moula-Guercy and Krapina, where the question is not who killed whom, but whether the dead were eaten or ceremonially cleaned. And there are the intimate ritual killings of the bogs, the bound child at Kayhausen, the ambiguous wound of the Huldremose Woman. Even amid this violence, people invested enormously in the dead, the ivory beads of Sunghir, the tender arrangement at Koszyce. The chronology stretches from 130,000 years ago at Krapina to the Iron Age bogs, and the geography spans Europe and Russia. violence came before farming, at Ofnet, and in the Neanderthal caves, and then seemed to intensify once people had fields, herds, and stored surplus worth fighting over. There is a further pattern worth naming, the difference between violence aimed outward and violence folded into ritual. The massacres at Talheim, Potočani, San Juan, and Koszyce look like the products of conflict between groups, of raids and reprisals over land and people. The bog killings and possibly the cannibalism sites look inward, directed at members of a community for reasons tied to belief rather than warfare. A child bound and drowned, a body cracked open and placed with care, these are not the acts of a raiding party. They are the acts of a society enforcing something on its own. Holding those two kinds of violence side by side is the only honest way to read the prehistoric record, because both were real and both leave their marks in the same soil. None of these stories could be told without a specialized science, the forensic archaeology of the dead. The first tool is the ability to tell perimortem trauma, injury at the time of death, from damage that happened long after, as bones sat in the ground. Fresh bone breaks differently from old bone, and reading that difference is how researchers know the Talheim victims were struck down rather than crushed by later soil. Cut mark analysis reads the fine traces left by stone tools, distinguishing butchery from natural marks made by animal teeth, trampling, or erosion. Under magnification, a stone tool cut has a distinctive shape, a fine V-shaped groove, different from the ragged puncture of a carnivore. Percussion pits and anvil abrasions reveal when a bone was cracked open for marrow, the telltale sign that someone wanted the fatty tissue inside. At Moula-Guercy, the decisive move was comparing human bones to animal bones treated the same way in the same deposit, letting the deer serve as a control against the Neanderthal remains. Radiocarbon dating fixes these events in time, and stratigraphy keeps the context honest. Ancient DNA now reconstructs kinship, telling us that Potočani's dead were strangers, while Koszyce's were one family, and that Sunghir's children were not close kin. Strontium isotopes trace where a person grew up, hinting at the mobility of the Huldremose Woman and the mixed origins at Talheim. CT scanning lets researchers look inside fragile bodies without destroying them, and careful pigment analysis detects the red ochre that coats so many of these dead. Every one of these methods can also overturn an older interpretation, which is why century-old sites like Krapina are still being argued over today. The hardest interpretive problem in this whole subject is telling cannibalism apart from ritual. The two can leave disturbingly similar marks. Removing flesh from a body to eat it, and removing flesh from a body to clean the bones for a funeral, both involve cutting muscle away from bone with stone tools. The signatures overlap. That is why Krapina has been argued about for more than 100 years, swinging between cannibalism, secondary burial, and mortuary defleshing. Moula-Guercy tried to break the deadlock with its animal comparison, and for many researchers it succeeded. But even a strong case runs into deeper questions. Was any given instance driven by hunger, by crisis, or by warfare, the consuming of a defeated enemy? Ethnographic parallels from more recent cultures offer models, but they can also mislead, since no living society is a perfect mirror of the deep past. Some historically documented peoples practiced endocannibalism, the respectful eating of one's own dead as a form of mourning, while others consumed enemies as an act of war or dominance. The same physical traces could be left by either, which is precisely the problem. The warm climate at both Moula-Guercy and Krapina weakens the simple starvation story, because these were not populations trapped in a frozen famine with no other food, and preservation bias means we only ever see a fraction of what happened. New taphonomy, the study of how remains decay and get marked, keeps reopening cases that seemed closed, which is both the frustration and the fascination of the field. For all the science, these sites still guard their mysteries. We do not know whether Ofnet was a single massacre, or a collection built up over many years, and that uncertainty changes its meaning entirely. We cannot say for certain how the Huldremose woman died, or whether her arm was truly wounded before death. We do not understand why the killers at Potočani struck down people who were not their own kin, or what drove that indiscriminate rage. The broken, ochre-packed thigh bones of the Sunghir child remain unexplained, poised between disability, ritual, and something we have no name for. We do not know whether the Kayhausen boy was killed because of his possible disability, or for reasons that left no trace. And we cannot always separate the many possible motives behind a single killing, whether a bog body was a criminal executed, a captive sacrificed, or a volunteer offered to the gods. The evidence gives us the wound, but rarely the reason. We cannot measure the full extent of the LBK massacre horizon, how many villages met Talheim's fate and left no pit for us to find. And we always face the limits of the evidence itself. Bones decay, DNA degrades, and only a sliver of the past survives to be dug up. Future methods will answer some of these questions, and will surely raise others we cannot yet imagine. What lingers after all 10 discoveries is a single stubborn paradox. The same hands that clubbed a family to death could also arrange those bodies with unbearable care, mother beside child, in the grave at Koszyce. The same people who packed a pit with severed heads also painted them with ochre and set them facing west. The same species that may have cracked open the bones of its own kind also carved 10,000 beads of ivory to honor 2 dead children. These finds unsettle us because they refuse the neat story. Prehistory was not a peaceful garden, and it was not only a slaughterhouse. It was both at once tender and cruel, mournful and violent, often in the very same moment. The people who left these traces were fully human, capable of everything we are capable of, for better and for worse. And the ground still holds more of them, waiting in the peat and the caves and the shallow pits, quiet for now, keeping stories we have not yet learned how to read,